Hold up.
What's up, Internet? Today we're back at it again, this time taking a look at federalism for all your government needs. So federalism, what is it? It's a way of organizing a nation so that two or more levels of government have formal authority over the same area and people. And to translate that, it's basically the distribution of power between the state and central government. Federalism determines powers given to the federal and state and local governments. So why did the framers select federalism for the new nation, right? There's a lot of different ways to structure a government. Why federalism? And one reason is there was a very strong loyalty to individual states. There was a distrust of a powerful national government because of their experiences with the English. And so as a result, federalism allows not only the state to have rights, but also for the federal government. And keep in mind, the US from its inception was vast and the population was spread out across a large area. And a single central government couldn't really govern effectively or efficiently. And so federalism became a logical choice. And also the framers believed it would prevent the tyranny of the majority. So is federalism the only way? And the answer is no. There are alternative ways of organizing a nation's government. In fact, federalism is really unique. As of 2017, there's roughly 15 nations that have a federal system, including the US. Most nations have a unitary system, and this basically means power is in the hands of the federal government. So the federal government really has the power. There is also confederation, and this is when almost all power is with the states and the federal government is weak. Remember, we've seen a confederation before. Our first government, the Articles of Confederation, which was replaced by the Constitution, was a confederation. And also when the South said bye-bye and formed the Confederate States of America, that is also an example of a confederation. Now, intergovernmental relations is really the interaction in dealing between federal, state, and local governments. So in my case, we got the US, the national government, the government of California, and the government of Los Angeles. And important to note, in a federal system, the central and state government oftentimes share power. And we'll look at some of the specific shared powers in just a moment. Now, the federal system, the Constitution allocates power between the national and state governments. It spells out a lot of things, and it's important you know the different definitions. Express powers, also known as enumerated or delegated or exclusive powers, are powers granted to the national government by the Constitution. The Constitution says the federal government can do these things. Implied powers are powers not specifically stated. They're not in the Constitution, but they're justified by the necessary and proper clause, which we'll look at in just a moment. Concurrent powers is all about sharing is caring. These are powers that the national and state governments share with one another. And finally, reserve powers are powers that are kept for the states. And you're really going to see this outlined in the 10th Amendment. Now, what is the constitutional basis of federalism? And although the Constitution created a more powerful federal government, it is important to note that states still had lots of power under the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution does not specify all the powers individual states have. And an important amendment you should know is the 10th Amendment. And this amendment states, a little confusing, kept all powers not explicitly forbidden. And you can read the text of the amendment right there. In other words, the states do have a large amount of power under a federal system. And as we mentioned previously, reserve powers are powers granted specifically to the states. And these things include regulation of intra-state commerce, trade within a state, organizing local governments within a state, responsible for state and federal elections, so monitoring and running the elections, ratifying constitutional amendments, and things like education and other kind of general public health and welfare issues. These are all powers that are reserved to state governments. Although there are powers that are reserved for the states, it's also important to note the Constitution does specify powers that the states do not have. You can't do it, states. And we call these the enumerated powers. And these are things like declaring war, conducting foreign policy, for example, entering into treaties, coining money, taxing interstate commerce, trade in between different states, granting titles of nobility, and a whole host of others. And these enumerated powers are explicitly found in Article 1, Section 8. It basically says what Congress can do. Over time, various amendments to the Constitution have expanded the powers of the federal government. For example, the 13th Amendment prohibits slavery. The 14th Amendment says you cannot deny equal protection of the law. The 15th and 19th Amendments say you cannot deny the vote because of a person's race or gender. And with this list, you can see that the federal government, the Constitution, denies certain powers to the states, certain economic power, foreign policy power, and through various amendments, individual liberties. Now, the federal government does have a duty, said duty, to the states, and this includes the government can't divide up states. It must protect states from invasion, from foreign and internal threats, and many other things. Now, remember, sharing is caring. Concurrent powers are shared powers between the federal government and state governments, and this includes taxes. So you pay federal tax, you pay state tax. Borrowing money, spending for the general welfare, establishing courts, and creating legislation and laws, all of these are shared powers between the federal and state governments. Now, a very important idea is this idea of the supremacy clause, which is in the Constitution right there. And this basically says federal laws supersede state laws, meaning federal law comes before state law. Although this is in the Constitution, there has been various debates and tests for this idea of national supremacy. There's been a tug of war over whether state or federal governments should govern or legislate on different issues. And some examples of this is the Civil War. It raised the question of state versus federal authority, state rights. The issue of slavery was hovering over this issue. Now, spoiler alert, you may know that federal authority over states was achieved. The North wins, but the debate continues. During the fight for racial equality, there was battles between federal government and state. For instance, the failure of Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, and the blocking of the Little Rock Nine into the high school, and the eventual intervention by President Eisenhower is another example of this debate about who does what and which law will reign supreme. But the supremacy clause basically says in a case of conflict between federal and state law, the federal law must be the one applied. And today there is a tug of war between federal and state laws, everything from medical marijuana and marijuana in general, immigration policy, so-called sanctuary cities, where there is disputes between federal and state law. Although the states have a lot of power under this federal system, it is important to note that national supremacy has been established. The powers of the federal government are supreme. And we've seen already the enumerated powers, the powers that are explicitly listed in the Constitution. But there's also something called implied powers, and these are derived from the elastic clause. So stay with me for a moment. The elastic clause basically allows Congress to make laws that are necessary and proper, super vague, to carry out its enumerated powers. So, for example, Congress has the power over the economy, interstate commerce, coining money, and things like this. What is not mentioned in the Constitution, though, is the ability of Congress to create a national bank. And during the 1790s, Hamilton and members of Congress used the elastic clause to create the Bank of the United States. And Hamilton and many Federalists argued the creation of the bank was an implied power because it was necessary for the government to function and for them to carry out their enumerated powers over trade and coining of money. Now, eventually, the Supreme Court hears a case that settles the issue in McCulloch versus Maryland. In 1819, the Supreme Court ruled the creation of a national bank was, in fact, constitutional. Maryland tried to tax the national bank, and the decision of McCulloch versus Maryland is very important because the interpretation of the U.S. Supreme Court was shifting the balance of power over time towards the federal government, saying, yes, in fact, Congress can create this bank. Congress has implied powers necessary to implement its enumerated powers, so the court case is reaffirming that. It is reaffirming the supremacy of the Constitution and this idea of federal laws over states. Now, people like Hamilton and the Federalist Party early on, they favor what is known as a loose construction or broad interpretation of the Constitution. And this basically means Congress could exercise powers not explicitly mentioned, and they use the elastic clause and the necessary and proper clause to justify their action. So anything not specifically prohibited in the Constitution, the federal government can in fact do. In the Constitution, you're also going to be seeing something called the Commerce Clause. And in the Constitution, it gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. Congress has a lot of power over the economy. And there has been an evolving definition and debate about the definition of commerce. What does this mean? And in Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled Congress could control interstate commerce. And in Gibbons, the Supreme Court is defining commerce very broadly. And the importance of the Gibbons versus Ogden decision was to further expand the power of the federal government. Now, an extremely important concept to understand is there has been a huge debate about the proper role of the government's regulation of business. What can the federal government do? So during the Gilded Age, you had this idea of laissez-faire, limited regulation, but industrialization increased calls for the government to regulate and intervene. We saw during the Progressive era, different levels of government, state, local, and federal government kind of passing laws against monopolies, child labor, reforming city government, the environment, etc. During the New Deal, you're going to see a huge increase of the government's power, regulatory power, banks, the stock market, and sectors of the economy. And more recently, there has been, in the late 80s, restrictions of congressional regulatory power. And what you're going to see is a new phase of federalism with more emphasis on the importance of state sovereignty and local control. So kind of rolling back the power and the role of the federal government. But once again, there is a huge debate around this issue. An important court case you should know about is the U.S. versus Lopez in 1995. This case ruled that Congress cannot use the Commerce Clause to make possession of a gun in a school zone a federal crime. So in U.S. versus Lopez, you actually see a erosion of the federal government's role in its regulatory power and deferring to the states and the local government. So we have under our federal system national supremacy, but it has been challenged and questioned, and the debate continues. And we see that in how you interpret the 10th Amendment. Under the 10th Amendment, it provides powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, advocates of state rights argue that the 10th Amendment gives the national government only those powers specifically granted to it in the Constitution. Meaning, if the Constitution does not give the federal government the power to do it, they can't do it. It's in the hands of the states. And an example of this that is contentious is education. Should the federal government have a role? It is a debate today in American politics. Now, many state rights individuals believe in what is known as a strict construction of the Constitution. And this is basically the belief is, if it's not in the Constitution, it can't be done. Power not granted to the federal government is given to the states, and the federal government can only do what the Constitution specifically stated. And this is the opposite of loose interpretation. Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Republicans were advocates of the strict construction approach. Of course, Jefferson's administration used a loose interpretation of the Constitution to buy the territory from France. But as mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court decisions have ruled that the 10th Amendment does not mean that the states are above the federal government. We saw the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, as well as Marbury versus Madison. All of these decisions have reinforced supremacy of federal laws. Now, what are the states' obligation to one another under the federal system? And one thing you should keep in mind is the full faith and credit clause. And this means states must honor the acts, records, and proceedings of other states. So if I go from California to Washington, the driver's license, marriage certificates, wills, all of those things must be honored by the other state. As with many things in life, this gets complicated because in 1996, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act that allowed states not to honor same-sex marriages from other states. So the Defense of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional in 2013, and you can see Barack Obama's tweet about that. Extradition is also an obligation states have. States are required to return a person accused of a crime in another state to that state for trial and or possible punishment. Privileges and immunities clause prohibits a state from discrimination against residents of another state. This is also complicated by the fact, for example, state colleges can charge higher tuition to out-of-state students, and some have argued this violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause. The battle continues. It's important you know about intergovernmental relations today and throughout time. Power has gradually shifted from states to the federal government. We saw that in those Supreme Court cases. This is not a stagnant process. And there has been a move from dual to cooperative federalism. And so let's break down these terms. Dual federalism and layered cake is oftentimes used as an example of dual federalism. And dual federalism basically is this: the federal government and states each have their own separate spheres, as well as local government, of authority. So power is divided between the federal, the state, and the local, and these entities are sovereign in these powers. There's clear boundaries. And from ratification of the Constitution to about the 1930s, there was a fairly strict division of power between the federal and state governments. The federal government did certain things and the states did others, like, for example, education, and the federal government stayed out of it. Now, there has been a slow movement towards cooperative federalism, and the great example for this form of federalism is marble cake. And what cooperative federalism is the federal government and states share spheres of power and responsibilities. And like in a marble cake, there's this mixing of flavors, and in cooperative federalism, there's a blurring of lines of authority. Now, a great example of cooperative federalism is in the area of education, whereas previously this was primarily a state issue. Today, the lines are much more blurred as the federal government, local government, and state government all play a role in education policy. Over time, the US system has transitioned from a dual federalism to a cooperative one. Some examples of this can be seen in the realm of education. During the Eisenhower administration in 1958, the National Defense of Education Act was passed by Congress as a result of the Soviet launch of Sputnik. And basically, under the National Defense of Education Act, the federal government increased its funding for universities and high schools, poured a lot of money into math and science, and played a much more active role in education policy along with state governments. Transportation is another great example of this more cooperative federalism. Also under President Eisenhower, the Interstate Highway Act was passed in 1956. Under the Interstate Highway Act, just like the Ed Act, the federal government is providing lots of money to states in order for them to build and develop their highway system. Wind power is shared in this cooperative federalist model. The federal government shares the costs by providing federal money that is typically attached to federal guidelines. So both the state and the federal government will administer these programs or funds, but very often the states must follow federal guidelines. So what about today? Let's overly simplify politics for a minute. Where do the political parties, line up on federalism? Typically, Republicans tend to favor a weaker national government. There's a general belief that states should handle many of the responsibilities, limited government regulations, and you can really see this idea in Reagan's inaugural address, where he basically says government is the problem. Democrats tend to favor a stronger national government to address social and economic issues. So using the power of the national government to advance policies on health, education, social welfare. And like most things, it's complicated, so you can't put any of these political parties entirely in one box or the other. Now, federalism since the 1930s under the New Deal and in the 1960s under the Great Society, there's been a massive expansion of government power. This growth of the marble cake, the federal government and the state government, those lines blurring. Now, a new pattern has really begun to emerge called devolution since the election of Reagan in 1980. And what this means is the shifting of power and responsibilities of policies from the central government to states and local government. Under Reagan and other Republican administrations, there's been a cuts to federal funds for various domestic programs, deregulation of key industries, in the belief that the federal government had grown too big. But as I mentioned, politics is very easily to oversimplify. It's complicated. So this idea of devolution, well, Republicans have increasingly expanded the role and power of the federal government at the same time they've been shrinking it. We could see this with No Child Left Behind, which increased the federal government's role in education under George Bush. And we could see this with the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 1996, largely by a Republican-controlled Congress, as well as being signed into law by the federal government. So the federal government is getting their hands in the mix of education and marriage, traditionally areas left to the states. Make sure you know about fiscal federalism. A key component of cooperative federalism is the distribution of federal grants. The federal government has a lot of influence over states through providing money. They can spend, tax, provide grants under this federal system. There are two main types of federal grants. The first one is categorical grants, and these are grants that can only be used by states for a specific purpose. Categorical grants are a significant way for the federal government to influence policy. They oftentimes have strings attached to them. One example of this is through crossover sanctions, and this is basically the process where the federal government withholds money unless the states change their policy. An example of a crossover sanction would be tying highway funding to increasing the drinking age to 21. That was a state issue, so the federal government said, if you do not increase your drinking age to 21, you are not going to get access to these federal funds for highway construction. And as a result, many states increased their drinking age to 21. Cross-cutting requirements basically means a condition on a federal grant is extended to all activities supported by federal funds. So for example, a university, if it discriminates in its athletics program against gender or race, they could potentially lose their federal aid for all of its programs. And as you can see, the federal government has tremendous leverage and opportunity to influence policy. There are two types of categorical grants. The most common is project grants, and this is awarded on a basis of a competitive application. Formula grants, federal money distributed based upon a formula, for example, the number of recipients, the income, and various other things, and this is largely how Medicaid funding is allocated. So categorical grants are one type of federal grants. The second is block grants, and this is federal money given to states that only specifies the policy area in which the money could be used. So they could use it for education or healthcare. It's much less restrictive. States have discretion on how to allocate the funds. They just need to have the particular area. Regardless of what type of grant we are talking about, there's a huge rush for federal dollars. Lawmakers and lobbyists attempt to secure federal dollars. Oftentimes, grants are accompanied by mandates. Mandates are requirements that states must provide certain services as a condition for receiving federal funds. Oftentimes, there are penalties if these services or requirements are not met, imposed by the federal government. Unfunded mandates are requirements placed on states by the federal government that are not funded. States do not get any money to achieve the policy goals. An example of this would be the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, which required states to provide more access to people who are disabled in city services like buses, but the federal government did not provide any funds. That is an example of an unfunded mandate. Really quickly, some good and bad about federalism. There are more opportunities for political participation. There's more levels of government, and that creates more opportunities for civic engagement. There's multiple access points, federal, state, local, for interest groups, and so people can participate in government and try to get their policies enacted. It also decentralizes policy. It allows voters in different areas to choose representatives that will promote their interests at both the state and federal level. And so, for example, in the 2016 presidential election, the Republican Party maintained control of Congress and won the presidency, but in certain states, for example, California, the Democrats maintained control. And as a result, politics can reflect not only national, but also state and local interest as well. Some bad stuff about federalism: preventing national majorities. Local interest can stop national policies supported by a majority of Americans. And a great example of this is what happened in many southern states during the Civil Rights Movement. The federal government, under Brown v. Board of Education, said that schools needed to be desegregated, but we saw widespread resistance in places like Little Rock, Arkansas. So sometimes policies are not being followed. It does increase the size of the bureaucracy. There is lots of government. We have 50 states and one national government, but there's many counties and school districts and so on. So this is a lot of layers of government. And finally, Oftentimes, there is disparity in services and spending between states. For example, in things like education policy, some states spend a lot more money while others do not, and resources vary widely between different states. A really important idea. This is in the framework, the interpretation of the 10th and 14th Amendments, as well as the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and other enumerated and implied powers, is at the heart of the debate over the balance of power between the national and state governments. This is a big theme. Thank you so much for watching. Click like on the video if it helped you out. Give me a thumbs up if you haven't already done so. Subscribe. If you have any questions, post them in the comments. And make sure you have a beautiful day. Peace.